Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to turn this off so we can all see each other better. And good morning to some of you, good afternoon to some of you, and welcome to our special guest today, Professor Robin Darling-Young. So as you know, this is the second seminar of our 6-seminar series this year, and we're very happy to have Professor Darling-Young from the Catholic University of America to be with us, and she was gracious to join us for our first session as well, and we'll be hearing from her in the second session today, along with Father Luke Deisinger. We want to maybe say a special word of gratitude up front that Father Deisinger's community is, we think, safe and sound from the recent fires. So that's a great answer to prayer for many of us if you were concerned about the Benedictine community, St. Andrew's up in the Antelope Valley. The fires parted like the Red Sea from all accounts, and we're all extremely grateful and relieved to hear that all is well, I hope. At least that's the latest that I read. That I take it you're not all there, but that nothing was destroyed.
The monks are living in a kind of enjoyable exile. They were first forced to evacuate to Redondo Beach, which, given that we are located primarily in the high desert, was hardly a penance. And as you say, the buildings have been spared. They're now at the House of Prayer for Priests in Los Angeles, and hope to go back perhaps this next week. They have to wait for power to be turned on and for the fire department to give the okay. But thank you for your prayers.
Absolutely. That was so good to hear. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, as you know, we'll have one more seminar this fall, next month at our apportioned date or assigned date that we've already scheduled. Our guest then will be Professor Paul Contino, who'll be sharing some readings on Dante that I'll circulate. Many of you are smiling because you know Professor Contino. I shared with him the recording of our previous session, and he was so glad to see all of your faces, and he asked me to say hello to each of you. So I pass that along, especially to our Pepperdine community. Yes, good. Oh, good applause that I see there in the comments. So we can look forward to that, and we'll try to get those readings out again. And so you have about a 2-week heads up, nothing too long, but I'm going to have that conversation soon. About the spring, we're lining up our speakers. It's a little bit of a dynamic situation, shall we say, as many things are this year, because we still don't have the official start of the academic year. And we want to make sure, at least for USC, and I'll check on Pepperdine, that we're not doing things that get in the way of your final exams. So we're trying to make some adaptations. We might have to adjust the date slightly. We'll see. I honestly don't know yet, but I'm trying to provide that information to you just as soon as I know it. Without further ado, unless anyone has any immediate questions up front for the good of the group, if so, maybe just raise your hand, your blue hand, if you have something for the group. But otherwise, I think we can go ahead and get started. I'm hoping that Father Luke can introduce Professor Darling-Young in more detail on our second session after we take our break. But we're going to jump right in, so we have ample time for discussion. You should have received the readings. If you haven't, ping me in the chat, and I will. I can try to send it to you here live as we go. But we should have received some readings from Professor Stefano Rebeggiani. Professor Rebeggiani is an associate professor of classics in our Department of Classics at USC. He hails from Rome. I think some of you may have seen his biography on our website. He is a specialist in Roman poetry and literature, and is graciously going to be speaking with us about 3 Roman utopias: Stoics, Epicureans, and, quote, a text called The Gospel of Augustus. So without any further ado, Professor Rebeggiani.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, David. Thanks for this introduction. Thanks. Can you hear me well? Okay. I'm just going to share the slides, and let me know if you can see them. Did they look okay? Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm again, thanks so much for taking the time to log in this morning, and thanks to David for the introduction. Thanks to the senior fellows for this wonderful opportunity. I'm going to talk today about these Roman utopias. You'll see, one thing I wanted to say is the readings, I've incorporated them in the slides, so if you don't have them, don't worry. They'll appear as part of the presentation at the moment when I discuss them. And the other thing is I'll be talking about 45 minutes, and then there will be time to ask questions. As you'll see, I have kind of privileged breadth over depth. I just wanted to show you as many as possible different approaches to utopian thinking in Roman society. I also wanted to show you that there is a lot of resources to think about Roman utopias, and some of these resources are actually a lot closer than you think. You don't need to cross the ocean to make a short experience of what it meant to live in a Roman utopia. We'll see all about it soon. Okay, so on his way back to Ithaca, Odysseus, the hero of Homer's Odyssey, incurs the anger of the sea god Poseidon and is shipwrecked on the island of Scheria, the homeland of the Phaeacians. No Greek had heard of these mysterious people before, yet the Phaeacians surpass every expectation. They welcome Odysseus, they offer him gifts and a role at court, and even the hand of the king's daughter, if he decides to stay. And Odysseus discovers that the Phaeacians are ruled by a wise and moderate king, and they live in harmony with the gods. They have no knowledge of war or strife, and spend their life amidst games, banquets, enjoying wine and poetry. This little island, Scheria, is in short an ideal society. It's the mirror opposite of the dysfunctional and strife-ridden Ithaca, where Odysseus longs to return. Scheria is thus a fitting starting point for this seminar. Not only is this the oldest utopia in Western literature, and by utopia, I mean in the broadest possible terms, the description of an ideal society, often temporally or geographically removed. But this little island becomes a symbol of utopian thinking in ancient texts, we shall see. It's also appropriate for a discussion of utopia to begin with the ancient world. The term utopia does not exist as such in Greek, but it's a pun coined by Thomas More as an allusive combination of two Greek phrases, utopia, eutopia, good place, and utopia, no place. Even if they did not have a word for it, the Greeks handed over to us the first and most influential utopias in the Western tradition. And Greek utopias were then re-elaborated and actualized by Roman thinkers. Thomas More was particularly indebted to Plato and Aristotle, but he also looked back at the works of the Roman intellectual Cicero. In this seminar today, we look at three ancient utopias, and my main focus will not be the Greek word, but it will be Rome. Now, the first obvious reason for it is that I am a Romanist, but that's by no means the only reason. For one, as we shall see, to talk about Roman utopias means to an extent also to talk about Greece. Two out of the three utopias that we're going to discuss today are in essence Roman actualizations of Greek philosophical ideas. And also one advantage of looking at Greek utopia through a Roman lens is that while the Greeks tend to be over theoretical, the practically minded Romans seek to turn utopian thinking into practice. Secondly, Roman depictions of the ideal society are particularly helpful in order to think about Christianity. The Gospel of Luke begins by mentioning the historical and cultural context in which the birth of Christ took place. Now, it happened that at this time, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be made of the whole inhabited world. This census, the first, took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. The message of Christianity arises in the context of a large territorial empire that spans the ancient Mediterranean basin, characterized by shared legal practices, languages, and political structures. The early audiences of the Gospels are made up of individuals whose thinking about politics and society is deeply shaped by Roman ideologies and by the reality of Roman institutions. In this context, as we shall see, the Christian announcement is not only simultaneous, but it's to an extent in competition with the visions of an ideal society propounded by Roman emperors. So here's the program for today. We will explore 3 Roman utopias: the Epicurean Utopia, the Stoic Utopia, and what I will call the Gospel of Augustus. And I'll conclude them briefly by looking at the very beginning of the Gospel of Jesus, not the Gospel of Augustus, and I'll compare it to some aspects of the 3 Roman utopias discussed so far. So let's get started with the Epicurean Utopia. Now, the first of our Roman utopias is the one imagined by Roman Epicureans, the followers of this guy, Epicurus, who developed his doctrine in Athens around 310 BCE. So Epicureanism is not original with Rome, but it spread in Rome in the 2nd and 1st century BCE, especially as a response to a serious cultural and political crisis. Illustrious poets Horace and Virgil were part of Epicurean communities, and Cicero, we're going to talk about him, who hated Epicureanism, often complained that the commoners in Rome flocked to the teaching of Epicureans because they were attracted by this philosophy's promise of pleasure. And one of the greatest poems in Roman literature, like if you want to read something from Rome, I would definitely recommend this poem. It's On the Nature of Things, composed by a guy named Lucretius. And it's a scientific investigation of the cosmos aimed at spreading Epicurus's doctrine among educated Romans. This is a particularly interesting text in that it crosses the boundaries between science and poetry, and is based on the assumption that poetry, better than prose, is able to penetrate and illuminate the unseen world of atoms and the laws of physics. What were Epicurus' teachings, though, and why were they so attractive to the Romans? Epicurus argued that the goal of life is pleasure, and he maintained that pleasure is the default state of our minds. When undisturbed by physical pain or mental distress, our minds experience a state of happiness. The role of philosophy is then to teach humans how to keep pain away from their bodies and how to keep their minds free from anxiety and fear. Hence, Epicurus conceived his philosophy as a fourfold medicine, tetrapharmakon in Greek, a remedy for the 4 most pressing sources of fear and anxiety for humans: the fear of the gods, the fear of death, the fear of physical pain, and the fear that pleasure is difficult to achieve. In response to these fears, Epicurus adopted an entirely materialistic view of the universe, in which only atoms and void exist. And in Epicurus' materialistic universe, there is no place for the gods, and there is no survival of the soul after death. Hence, there is nothing to fear in death. He also taught that pleasure is easy to attain. All it takes for you is to remove pain from the body and anxiety from the mind. But what was Epicurus' plan for society? And how did Roman thinkers seek to implement it? Let us take a look at the passages I've provided in the readings. Now, this first passage comes from Lucretius' account of the birth of society in his On the Nature of Things, the poem I just mentioned. The Roman poet is here describing the formation of monarchies. A crucial element, you'll notice, in his view, is the connection between fear of death and political order. Human beings are terrified by death, and they are obsessed with self-preservation. This puts them on a path of collision with other individuals. They look for power in a desperate attempt to make their life more secure, but in so doing, they end up enmeshed in countless conflicts. But people, I'm reading from the text, wanted to win fame and power for themselves in order that their fortune might be based on a firm foundation and their wealth might enable them to lead a peaceful life, but all in vain. for as they strove to climb to the summit of success, they made their path perilous. In this account, the first experiments in organized societies, monarchies, collapse in anarchy and violence. When the violence becomes unbearable, humans resort to the creation of a new social compact. This is but a necessary compromise. It entails protection from violence, but it also forces humans to live in a state of fear. The state, in Lucretius's view, cannot do without fear and violence to maintain order. The human race, says Lucretius, utterly weary as it was of leading a life of violence and worn out with feuds, was the more ready to submit voluntarily to the restraint of ordinances and stringent laws. The reason why people were sick and tired of a life of violence was that each individual was prompted by anger to exact vengeance more cruelly than is now allowed by equitable laws. Ever since that time, fear of punishment has poisoned the blessings of life. Now, if this sounds familiar to students of Hobbes, it's no coincidence. Hobbes was an avid reader of Lucretius and was deeply influenced by his ideas. In light of this pessimistic view of human society, a fundamental teaching of Epicurus was to never actively engage in political life. This does not prevent Epicureans, however, from developing their own version of the ideal society. Precisely as fear of death puts man on a path of collision, when someone has overcome the fear of death, that creates the conditions for friendship. Human beings who live according to reason and have conquered their fear of death will naturally create networks of friends who protect each other from physical harm and help provide to one's needs. Friends will convert other friends to Epicureanism, and one day, when a sufficient number of people will be converted, there will be no need for laws or institutions. No longer afraid of death, people will stop fighting each other and will live in peace without the need of an oppressive state. The Epicurean utopia is thus a world without states, just community of friends. But they're very aware that this can become a reality only when everyone is converted to Epicureanism. So what to do in the meantime? The Epicureans have a plan for the here and now, and their plan consists in withdrawing from society and forming small communities of friends, little seeds of the collective utopia that was to come one day. And here I'd like to show you an example of such a community by looking at an extraordinary archaeological discovery. That's the Villa dei Papiri in Herculaneum. It's a Roman mansion on the Bay of Naples. The villa was buried in ashes by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and take a look at this. And this wasn't even one of the largest mansions in the area. It's kind of a middle-sized Roman villa, including a pool. It's great, frankly unbelievable. Anyway, now it was destroyed in 79 CE. When Vesuvius erupted, it was a catastrophic event that destroyed the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, claiming perhaps as many as 16,000 lives. The villa was discovered and excavated in the 18th century. This is how it looks today. And although this is a well-known archaeological site, few people know that the villa was also the seat of an important Epicurean community, a little Epicurean utopia, in fact. How do we know this? Because the eruption has preserved some of the books kept in its library, and this is the only surviving library from antiquity. The heat from the volcanic explosion charred the papyrus scrolls kept in the villa's library, preserving them at the same time that it made them really difficult to unwrap. The extant scrolls allow us to identify the owner of this library as the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus. We know from ancient sources that Philodemus was hosted by the Roman aristocrat Piso, who gathered around himself an Epicurean community. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually visit one of these Roman mansions and get a sense of what it meant to live in one of these ancient utopias? But wait, we can do it, for an actual size replica of the Villa dei Papyri has been built by the oil billionaire Getty in Malibu, the Getty Villa. So this is a real size replica that, has the same dimensions, and it's actually very well made, corresponds to the original. You can, in fact, stroll through the alleys and porticos of the Getty Villa, and you will even find the same pieces of art admired by Philodemus and his Epicurean friends, including many statuettes of Epicurus. As you walk around, you'll notice that the villa was built as a microcosm. Although it stood next to the sea, there were no windows directed at the outside world. The house reproduced in miniature some of the public spaces of Greek cities. For instance, the peristyle. It was meant to reproduce the Greek palaestra, the open-air colonnades where Greeks exercised and discussed philosophy. The implication seems to have been the idea of creating a miniature of the polis within the house. In one of his poems, Philodemus, the philosopher who was resided at this villa, writes to the master of the house, Piso, inviting him to join him for a banquet. "Tomorrow, friend Piso," he writes, "your musical comrade drags you to his modest banquet. You will see faithful friends, and you will hear things far sweeter than the land of the Phaeacians." As you can see, Homer's Utopia has become a reality in this small community of friends, segregated from the rest of the world as they await the conversion of humanity. Epicureans experience the pleasure of friendship in their little utopias in which social distinctions have been abolished. I wonder if their Epicurean credo helped the villa resident in their last tragic moments. On August 24 of 79 CE, the explosion of Vesuvius killed them all in just a few instants. Let us summarize our findings about Epicurean utopia. Epicureanism spread in Rome at a time of great crisis, great political crisis, and in the face of this crisis, Roman Epicureans found refuge in a doctrine that suggests that the ideal society is only possible by transforming the minds of individuals. Altering political institutions is pointless unless the root of human enmity, namely fear of death, is removed. Friendship is the result of reason and can therefore be taught. And one consequence of this position is that proselytism, converting other people to Epicureanism, comes before political activity. In addition, in Epicureanism, the ultimate conversion of humanity does not bring about a better state, but it ends political institutions as we know them. The Epicurean utopia is not at state at all. It's a new order in which political institutions dissolve to give way to a cluster of small communities bound by friendship. And since that's not expected to occur anytime soon, Epicureans should withdraw from society and live in isolation in their small utopian communities in what looks like an ancient forerunner of the Benedict option. Our second utopia is the one devised by Roman Stoics. Stoicism is by far the most popular of ancient philosophies today, no doubt about it. From legendary bodybuilder Arnold Schwarzenegger to podcaster Tim Ferriss to actor Keanu Reeves. You can consult an updated list of converts on thedailystoic.com. This philosophical school was, however, originally founded by Zeno in Greece at the end of the 4th century BC, pretty much at the same time as Epicureanism. Like many other Greek doctrines, Stoicism spread in Rome in the 2nd and 1st century BC, where it became the most popular philosophical system among members of the Roman elite. Cicero used Stoicism to justify Roman imperial rule. Seneca, the most important Roman philosopher and the counselor to the infamous Emperor Nero, not only wrote about Stoicism, but practiced it till the very end, till the time, that is, of his heroic death at the hands of Nero himself. And the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whom some of you may remember as the elderly wise emperor in The Gladiator, was also a convinced Stoic. Okay, what did Stoics believe? Now, the crucial tenet of Stoicism is that happiness consists in possessing virtue, and virtue consists in the correct use of reason. Through the correct exercise of reason, humans can achieve a perfect control of their minds. This allows them to resist the influence of irrational impulses like emotions and passions. This perfect control of one's mind is independent of external circumstances. You can achieve it whether you're rich or poor, healthy or sick, and it makes in turn all external circumstances irrelevant, to the extent that a Stoic wise man would be happy even on the rack. The ultimate goal of Stoicism is thus the individual's absolute freedom from all external influences. Fine, but what did Stoics think about society? Now, the foundation of Stoic theories of society is the concept of Oikeioisis. It's a somewhat mysterious term. It's usually translated with endearment or affinity. What it matters is that according to this principle of Oikeioisis, our fundamental desire as human beings is for self-preservation. As we develop as rational beings, however, we do not narrowly associate our self-preservation with our own physical survival. One obvious example is a parent's concern for his children, which the Stoics conceive as a natural widening of our circle of concern. A further widening would be concern for one's extended family and friends, and then concern for one's whole community or society. This process of widening one's circle of concern should not stop once it encompasses all of human society. Eventually, one's Oikeioisis should extend to include the entire cosmos, generating a concern for the preservation of all human beings and the natural world. This leads naturally to the idea of cosmopolitanism, for which the Stoics are particularly famous today. As Martha Nussbaum puts it, the Stoics developed the image of the cosmopolites, the citizens of the world citizen, arguing that each of us dwells in effect in two communities, the local community of our birth and the community of human argument and aspiration that is truly great and truly common. And she's quoting Seneca here, in which we look neither to this corner nor to that, but measure the boundaries of our nation by the sun. In this community that is most fundamentally the source of it is this community that is most fundamentally the source of our moral obligation. With respect to the most basic moral values, such as justice, we should regard all human beings as our fellow citizens and neighbors. The idea of the world citizen is in this way the ancestor and source of Kant's idea of the kingdom of ends. The cosmopolis is thus the most powerful version of a Stoic utopia. A Stoic wise man will not follow the laws dictated by his non-wise legislator, but he will follow the natural law dictated by reason. The same natural law will govern the actions and choices of all those who are correctly using their minds, regardless of the nature of the societies in which they live. In a Stoic utopia, in which everyone would be a wise man, states and laws will no longer be needed. Everyone will live according to reason and the laws of nature. Okay, and what happens to this idea in Rome? This Stoic ideal is modified and adapted, this idea of the cosmopolis, as an enactment of a Stoic utopia. This Stoic ideal is modified and adapted in a very interesting way by Roman thinkers who explore practical applications of Greek utopian thinking. In the 2nd and 1st century BCE, Rome is under attack. At this point, the Romans have already conquered the entire Mediterranean, and many of their subjects question their rule. In this context, Cicero uses the Stoic view of the cosmopolis to justify Roman imperialism. In his De Republica, he makes the point that Roman rule over foreign peoples is good, for it fulfills the ideal of the Stoic cosmopolis. The Roman Empire has in fact replaced local customs and laws with a shared form of government and a shared legal framework. Echoing Plutarch, Cicero makes the point that what philosophers could only dream of has been made a reality by the Roman armies. There is a large problem with this idea. As I anticipated, Stoicism's most fundamental principle was the safeguard of human freedom. But the Roman Empire has created this shared commonwealth precisely by depriving people of their freedom. To this critique, Cicero responds with an argument based on the analogy of the mind. In individuals, the rational mind controls and regulates the irrational impulses who would otherwise tear it apart. Something similar happens in international relationships. Rational powers like Rome control and regulate peoples who would otherwise live in strife. Echoes of this idea are found later in the works of Seneca as well. The philosopher Seneca wrote a booklet addressed to the Emperor Nero, inviting him to act as the mind of humanity, a representative of Stoic reason. The masses, Seneca observes, will naturally self-destruct unless guided by an illuminated power. By becoming an embodiment of Stoic reason, the emperor can begin to turn the cosmopolis into a reality and help his subjects follow the natural law. It's a solution fraught with problems. For one, as I anticipated, it entails depriving people of their freedom in order to make them live according to reason, sort of a paradox from a Stoic point of view. Moreover, this view seems to imply that a majority of individuals and entire nations will never achieve a use of reasons that make them able to govern themselves. And the argument is used to legitimate depriving them of their freedom. Finally, this is also a short-lived and mostly ineffective idea. In practice, Cicero had his head and hands chopped off before he could see his ideal vision turned into a reality. And Seneca spent the last years of his life away from active politics and turned to a much more pessimistic version of Stoicism, one in which the cosmopolis is but an idea, a city of the mind that the sage can join virtually while he continues to live in his imperfect human society. And he ended up executed by the very same sovereign he had tried to instruct. Let us summarize our findings about the Stoic Utopia and its Roman adaptation. This Roman adaptation of Stoicism is as a distinctive advantage over the Epicurean point of view, in that, unlike Epicureanism, it creates a legitimate space for political action and provides a role for the Stoic wise man in politics. Like the Epicureans, the Stoics agree that the ideal way of achieving the utopia is for everyone to convert to Stoicism, for they believe that fraternity is the product of reason and can be taught. However, unlike the Epicureans, they have a plan for the here and now, which does not involve escaping the world of politics and withdrawing to secluded communities. Their idea takes into account the fact that the majority of people will, for one reason or another, be unable to achieve the measure of reason that's necessary to live in peace without the need of a state. So the alternative solution consists in having a few illuminated Stoics in positions of power, acting as the mind to the body politics. I hope that this is not looking too abstract and removed from today's concerns. If you think about many of these questions are relevant today, how can hatred and division be eradicated? Will it be enough to create perfect mechanism to ensure equality without substantially changing the hearts and minds of individuals? Is fraternity the product of reason? Can it be taught? Is it legitimate to deprive people of freedom in order to make them free? Let us now move to our third and last Roman utopia, the Gospel of Augustus. This one takes its name from the first emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus. For a large part of its history, Rome was a republic governed by magistrates, elected magistrates, but in the first century BCE, the republican system of government collapsed under the pressure of the huge territorial expansion of the Roman Empire. Rome experienced a long season of civil war, which resulted in massive human losses, destruction of the countryside, and an economic crisis of lasting proportions. It's at this time of uncertainty and despair that the ancient world is mysteriously pervaded by a wave of hope. A new vision of the future is forged, one that combines political and religious ideas. Such a vision is reflected in an exceptional poem by Virgil, and this is one I had included in the readings. Virgil being the most famous and most influential poet of Rome. His Eclogues are a collection of poems on the life of shepherds. But the fourth poem in the collection, and I've given you extracts from this, it's composed in 42 BC and introduces a change of topic. The poem prophesies the birth of a divine child who will bring about a new golden age. Now is come the last age of Cumean song. The great line of the centuries begins anew, right, Virgil? Translation don't make it justice. Now the Virgin returns, the reign of Saturn returns. Now a new generation descends from heaven on high. Only do you, pure Lucina, smile on the birth of the child, under whom the iron brood shall at last cease, and the golden rays spring up throughout the world. And later on in the poem, there is a idyllic vision of the future that will be fulfilled when this child is born. When now the strength of years has made you a man, he's talking to this divine child here. Even the trader will quit the sea, nor will the ship of pine exchange wares. Every land will bear all fruits. So almost like nature is bearing fruits by itself. Earth will not suffer the harrow, nor the vine the pruning hook. The sturdy plowman too will now lose his oxen from the yoke. This fourth eclogue is a crucial text for the Western tradition. Among other things, it contributed to Virgil's reputation as a prophet of Christianity. Endowed with divine knowledge, Virgil had predicted the birth of Christ 42 years in advance. After all, the text resembles closely ancient Testament prophecies, such as the one by Isaiah, who likewise announces a child born of a virgin. It's interesting that in Virgil, the birth of this child is not placed in an unspecified time in the future, but is expected to happen at the time of the poem's composition in 42 BCE. Scholars are still busy discussing the identity of this divine child, but it's important for us to realize that Virgil has in mind a real historical figure, although clothed in the aura of myth. In Virgil's poem, the project for a just society in the future takes the form of the expectation of a savior, an exceptional individual who can restore the relationship between gods and humans, while at the same time introducing a new political and social order. Warned by civil strife and conscious of the failure of traditional political structures, human beings will relinquish power in the hands of a benevolent monarch. In the years after the publication of Virgil's poem, this expectation of a divine savior is appropriated by Augustus, the Roman leader who emerges victorious from the season of Rome's civil wars and transforms Rome into a monarchy. The sentiments evoked by Virgil's poem are found in official documents of the new regime, and to call this message a gospel, as I have done, is not inappropriate, for this is precisely how Romans called it. Here is a text from a local Roman magistrate from the city of Priene, commenting on the new order established by Augustus. Since it seems good to the Greeks of Asia in the opinion of the divine priest Apollonius, blah, 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 since Providence, which has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has given us Augustus, whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things. And since he, Caesar, by his appearance, excelled even our anticipation, surpassing all previous benefactors, and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done, and since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good tidings for the world, and so on and so forth. In the Greek original, the phrase good tidings is rendered to the word evangelion, the same word that it's used in the Gospels themselves, and in the early church to refer to the accounts of Jesus's life. And I've underlined it here in red. In practice, what was this Gospel of Augustus all about? This view of an ideal society, as you suspect, is not made of precise policy plans, but centers around generic messages of hope, peace, and prosperity. And it's fascinating that these messages are widely broadcasted, not only through text, but they are inscribed in the cityscape of Rome. We can still get a sense of this utopian view of Rome by visiting the ancient buildings in Rome. And that's why I wanted to offer a sample of this utopia by looking at 3 interconnected monuments erected by Augustus in the Campus Martius area. The Pantheon, the Areopagus, or Altar of Peace, and Augustus's sundial, the Horologium Augusti. These are quite extraordinary. I recommend anyone who visits Rome to go have a look at them. Now, let's begin with the Altar of Peace. This is what it looks like in this modern building. Now, this altar celebrated the emperor's ability to guarantee peace to humanity. Its central relief, one of the most famous pieces of Roman sculpture, portrayed Italy, accompanied by images of rebirth and fecundity. You can see all these plants springing up and these little animals and the 2 babies, of course. The elaborate vegetal decoration provide a sense of luxuriousness and prodigious growth, while at the same time imparting a feeling of order and control. The monument symbolism worked in connection with the nearby sundial, a massive calendar device, an original obelisk transported from Egypt, now in Piazza di Montecitorio in Rome, cast its shadow on a large marble pavement with markings designed to indicate the different times in the year. On Augustus's birthday, September 23rd, the shadow from the obelisk pointed in the direction of the Arapakis. You can see it from this picture here, right? Signifying that the emperor was born to bring peace, and that his birth was somehow written in the stars. So the pictures of the traces of the ancient pavement markings recently discovered at the bottom of a building in Rome. Now, the idea that the emperor accomplishes a supernatural salvation of humanity leads naturally to the idea that the emperor is in some sense divine. And this is precisely the idea encoded in the Pantheon, the third monument in the Campus Martius complex. This is a masterpiece of ancient engineering. The Pantheon was conceived as an image of the heavens and the gateway to the divine world. The building contained statues of all the major gods, with the significant addition of a statue of Augustus. The implication was that Augustus was destined to join the gods in heaven after death. On the day of Rome's foundation, on April 21st, the beam of light from the vault opening, the oculus, illuminated the temple's threshold, where the emperor would stand, the stream of light visually marking his divine nature and imminent ascent to heaven. I'm concluding. Let us summarize our findings about this Gospel of Augustus. For all its monumental choreographies, the Gospel of Augustus had obvious limits. For one, it failed to respond to the Epicurean objection that you need to heal man's heart in order to reform society. Augustus has no recipe for a renewal of human relationships, except that all power be yielded to him. Just as in Epicureanism, the crisis of traditional institutions issues in a collective renunciation to politics, but in the Epicurean system, this withdrawal from active politics leads to the formation of little democratic communities. In the Gospel of Augustus, the withdrawal from politics enables an authoritarian turn in which all power is vested in one individual. The other obvious limit of this view is that it is coextensive with the life of the emperor. If this renovation of society depends from an extraordinary individual, what happens when the emperor dies? How can such a system have stability and extend beyond the life of an individual? This ideal was in fact welcomed with enthusiasm at the beginning and became less and less credible. Later, emperors kept repeating Augustus's message, though few were prepared to give it any credit. Let me conclude by getting to the fourth part, where I will be talking very briefly about the Gospel of Jesus. And I will contrast some aspects of the announcement of Jesus' birth with elements of these three Roman utopias that we've seen so far. According to the Gospel of Luke, in the 31st year of Augustus's reign, an angel appeared to a young woman by the name of Marian. The angel's announcement involved the birth of a king and the beginning of a kingdom without end. One that will, in fact, grow and spread within the Roman Empire and eventually outlive it. I will conclude by contrasting this announcement of the single God with the three Roman utopias sketched in the paper. My point is to show that, although very different, this new kingdom is designed to respond to some of the anxieties encoded in Roman utopias. Let's go back to the Annunciation Gospel. He came to her and said, the angel, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you. Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." The language, as you can see, is both religious and political. The child who will be born is a king. He will establish a kingdom without end. And just like the prodigious child of Virgil's poem, is not to be born at an unspecified mythical time. His birth is imminent and his kingdom begins immediately. Now, the announcement of this king is deeply tied to the Jewish expectation of a savior or Messiah. But we should not forget that these same expectations were alive in the non-Jewish world, as we have seen in the inscription from Priene, in which Augustus is celebrated as a divine savior. The parallel passage in Matthew qualifies this announcement in an interesting way. In Matthew, the angel appears to Joseph in a dream and says, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel." Here too we see the figure of the Savior, as in the case of Augustus, but the evangelist explains that Jesus will save his people from his sins. As Pope Benedict XVI noted, the angel's announcement offers at the same time too little and too much. In Jewish theology, forgiveness of sin is a prerogative of God. Announcing a Messiah who brings about salvation from sin is tantamount to announcing that God himself will appear in human form, a theological impossibility for a Jew. From a Roman point of view, the message offers too little. As we have seen, the ancient world was eagerly expecting a salvation which responded to the ongoing political crisis. Jews hoped for a Messiah who would restore the kingdom of Israel and deliver it from the Roman yoke, while Romans awaited a political Messiah who could guarantee peace, order, and material prosperity. Salvation from sin was at the top of no one's list. The Gospel of Jesus does not have as its primary goal healing the ills of society. This does not mean, however, that the angel's announcement does not have social or political implications. As Pope Benedict puts it again, man is a relational being. If the primary and most fundamental relationship of man, the relationship with God, is upset, nothing can be in order. Healing this relationship with God will create the preconditions for transforming society, for it will allow human beings to establish new relationships based on love. In conclusion, we can see that this Gospel of Jesus transforms and completes and integrates the three Roman utopias seen so far. The Gospel of Christ shares with the Epicureans the idea that the ideal society can only be achieved by changing the hearts of individuals. It agrees with the Stoics that individuals should actively participate in politics, and has in common with the Gospel of Augustus the idea that salvation is initiated by an extraordinary individual. There are, however, important differences. As the Gospel of Augustus, the Gospel of Jesus promises that salvation will come through an extraordinary individual, but this extraordinary individual is not a political figure and does not come primarily to fix social or political problems, nor to bring material prosperity. But he will provide that healing of human relationships for which the Gospel of Augustus had no recipe. Unlike the Gospel of Augustus, this salvation extends further than the life of the emperor. This is not only because of Jesus' resurrection, his overcoming of physical death, but also because Jesus, unlike Augustus, promises to make his subjects participant in his divine nature. Precisely because it is not attached to any political institution, and because it is ultimately founded in the faith of the Christian community, the kingdom of God extends from generation to generation and will have no end. In common with the Stoics, the kingdom of God has a cosmopolitan appeal. It's not limited to a specific people or society, but should ultimately encompass the whole of humanity. Unlike Roman version of Stoicism, however, the Christian cosmopolis does not need a state to be turned into a reality. The reason for this is that participation to the cosmopolis is available to everyone, for it is not, as in Stoicism, the result of a long training and a command of reason that only a few can attain. And it's not achieved by putting individuals under the guidance of a few illuminated sages. Finally, in common with Epicureans, the gospel of Jesus has the idea that society cannot be fully reformed unless relationships between human beings are healed. But again, for Epicureans, this internal renewal is ultimately the product of a correct use of reason. According to Epicureans, humanity has the power to redeem itself, for reason can generate fraternity. In Christianity, redemption is ultimately God's work. To use Pope Benedict's words in Caritas in Veritate, reason by itself is capable of grasping the equality between men and of giving stability to their civic coexistence, but it cannot establish fraternity. This originates in a transcendent vocation from God the Father, who loved us first, teaching us through the Son what fraternal charity is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. That was just remarkably rich, and I'm sure we all have a lot of questions and reflections benefiting from that. Maybe we'll start. I would like to give everyone a minute to collect their thoughts, and if you have, I'll do the moderating here. If you have questions, responses, questions about some of the details that Stefano went through, or asking him to extend his thoughts further, especially on the lines at the end. Just to review, I really appreciated the way that you laid out these three different ancient schools of philosophy as a personal therapy, but also as a political vision. And you reminded us that there is that the Christian idea of a utopia, of course, doesn't only begin with Thomas More, and it doesn't only begin with Christianity, in fact, and that the way that we can appreciate the distinction of a Christian notion of utopia when we eventually get there in 2021 in our seminar will be against the backdrop of the ancient context, as you say, that was the kingdom of Christianity responded to the anxieties encoded in Roman utopias. I thought that was very helpful to emphasize. And then the way you drew attention to these three different models of what is the human being that each group is committing to, and what's a model of politics. I mean, I understood it to be the Epicureans foreground fear as a motivation. The Stoics put a lot of weight on reason as a capacity for human beings, and the Augustan vision of power being exerted to control and to shape a new kind of community. And then this responds to different kinds of politics, the withdrawal of the Epicureans, the elites of the Stoics, and interestingly, the kind of evacuation of the political space in the Augustan situation, when the power is so concentrated that what you're asked to do as a citizen is just not participate, just to be ruled, right? So there's sort of three different anthropologies, accounts of the human, three different accounts of what the political is, and then maybe we can discuss this difference that Christianity makes. So I see some hands raised. We'll go to Jason Blakely first. And please, if others of you have hands to raise, and I'll try to keep up, and we'll go in sequence here. Thank you so much, Stefano. Just a remarkable presentation. Jason, the floor is yours.
Yeah, that was excellent, Stefano. Fantastic. Just two comments that they're kind of questions, and I'd love to hear your response to them. The first is, what you delineate, which is fascinating, of the Christian form of community, of idealized community, as a response to Stoics, Epicureans, and the cult of Caesar and Augustus and whatnot, you delineate an idealization there where you say Christianity offers a response. And one thought I have is Christianity only offers that response if it's a particular Christianity, because there are rival interpretations of Christianity. So one comment I have that I'd be interested in your thoughts if it provokes you is a particular political theology resolves those dilemmas. But for instance, just to take one example, retaining the response to the Stoics, Christianity is a true cosmopolis, only happens if Christianity doesn't take an imperial turn, as it in fact does do with Constantine, arguably, a lot of people think, or as it arguably does today. A lot of Christians, what you're describing doesn't look to me like what a lot of Christians do. A lot of Christians, I think, have tied their theology to sort of savior by a powerful figure, particularly in our own society. So I'm wondering about all the ways it can go wrong. And likewise, privatization through Epicureanism, like Dreyer's Benedict option looks to me, in your terms, kind of Epicureanized.
Yeah.
The second comment, shorter, this one is maybe ends more in a question, is I'm really fascinated by what you say about the Roman turn toward practical corroboration of these idealized societies. Away from Greek theorization. I'm thinking of Pierre Hadot and Philosophy as a Way of Life for those who are familiar with his work. And my question here, maybe it's related to the first question, is how do you corroborate? I mean, I'm really curious, how did the Romans, how did this world that's so different from our own corroborate or verify rival ways of life? You know, if it was there a practical, I don't want to say proof, that's not quite the right language, but was there a way of verifying or solidifying a particular rival Epicurean versus Stoic versus Augustan versus Christian way of life that wasn't at the theoretical level, that maybe might appear strange to us since we're so highly theorized as modern people? Anyway, I thought it was fantastic. So just a couple thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, those are two great questions. In answer to your first question, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I have, as you will see, and I have to simplify a lot and kind of, I mean, not present a very nuanced view. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that. And you're absolutely right that, in fact, that what happens next in the history of Christianity is that there is this imperial turn, and there is this idea that it's the structure, the political structure of the Roman Empire can satisfy to an extent and implement this view. And of course, there is resistance and there is questioning of this, right? And Augustine is an example, of course. The reason why I think this is particularly interesting is that, and it's particularly relevant today, it's because as Pope Benedict put it at one point, we are in a post-Constantinian era, in a sense, right? We're back to square one. We are in a society in which this dream of the Christian Empire has now collapsed, and the new season has opened. That makes the reality more similar to if you want, the situation of Christians in the origin, where they did not immediately expect that the political order could somehow become the hands of this project, if that makes any sense. And
it does. If I can just cut in and say, it's collapsed in Europe, but not the United States.
Well, what you were saying before, I think it's these three positions, I find them all very relevant, right? This idea of, the Messiah or Savior, the idea of the Benedict option, like withdrawing from society because society is evil and it's incurable. That's also very interesting for the Epicureans, that you cannot redeem or cure society. And then finally, this idea of an elite that kind of think that people will never actually get it. So we need to get in power and somehow transform the structure and force them to be free, right? This is all, I think, very actual, very contemporary position. As to your second question, I don't know that I have an answer. It is very interesting. In the Roman world, there's a lot of polemic and dialogue in practice, and in terms of what it's the good way of life and who's achieving it. Like reading Lucretius is very interesting from this point of view, because he's very aggressive and he constantly presents a number of examples. And Cicero does the same. Like he puts in dialogue Stoics and Epicureans, and presents historical figures who lived Stoic doctrines and Epicureans, and contrast them, and wants to show who's right, who's wrong, what are the good points and bad points that any position has. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Great questions. And I'm excited to see some more student hands coming up too from our esteemed junior fellows. Let's go to Daniel next, and then Anne-Marie.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Stefano. I thought I took so much from all three different types of schools. And I was just curious as to the Via de Papyri, and these like smaller communities. I was wondering if they were extensive outside of or across Italy, or what was then Italy. Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard for us to know. We know that there were many of them, and we know that they were particularly. I wanted to go back to the Villa de Papyri because they were particularly present in the region of Campania, so in the Bay of Naples. We know that there were many of them. We're evidence of several Epicurean communities. And one problem with it, also we have people talking about Epicurean communities and Epicurean groups. The survival of the Villa de Papyri is quite extraordinary, because there we get the texts that tell us that Epicureans were there actually. If you want, there's also a fascinating question is whether there were Christians in Pompeii when the cities were destroyed, whether there were Christian communities, because we know that St. Paul was in Puteoli and met a Christian community some 10 years before, and Puteoli is just nearby. So, we can talk about it later on.
Cool. Yeah, no, I was just fascinated by the idea of their take on like friendship and conquering death. And I think in my own personal experience, I've come to deal with that. Like, I think something that's so common in our human condition of questioning, what comes after. And I really like how one of their central tenets is conquering that fear of the unknown. And I think towards like what that even means, and I instantly think about like the Lord's Prayer and that line, like, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I think that's so relevant in connecting with the other people around us and the creation of community, and how important that is in the Epicurean, philosophy, and also what we have today. So I thought that was really cool to kind of.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I'm a great fan of Epicureans, not because I've converted to Epicureanism, and I wouldn't convert, but I think they're incredibly deep. I mean, this idea that they have, that the problem of human beings, what makes it impossible for us to live at peace, is that we're terrified of death. So right. If you overcome fear of that, because we were set with so we can love one another because we're too vulnerable. So every contrast is a reminder of our vulnerability, and that makes it impossible to truly have communion. I think this is incredibly deep, and I think it's also something that's addressed by Christianity. And then also, of course, they have this idea. We can discuss how effective is their solution to the fear of death, right? The idea that nothing survives, and so you shouldn't be afraid because you're not there to be afraid, which is, I think, doesn't address the fear of disappearance, which is what concerns us, right? Precisely our own instinct to survival, fights against the sense, and they don't have a recipe for it.
Right. Cool. No, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for this question.
Great question, Daniel. Let's go, in the interest of time, we can go until around 10:30 or just after. Let's hear from a question or comment from Anne-Marie, and then straight to Jack. We'll do two at once, and then we'll go back to Stefano. So Anne-Marie and then Jack.
First I just want to say, again, thank you for the talk. This is stuff that we've talked about together before in like grad seminars, but pulling it all together like this and then looking at kind of the Christian afterlife of these philosophies is really, really beneficial for me. I wanted to talk talk about a concept you mentioned at the beginning, which is this notion of utopias that are geographically and temporally distant, that we saw a lot in the Odyssey, and also that reading of Lucretius that you sent us, where he is imagining himself watching these people below that are suffering, and there's this bliss that he is not the person who is suffering. But by the time we get to the end of your talk, we're talking about utopias that have the potential to exist without this geographical and temporal separation, that in the Gospel of Augustus and the Gospel of Jesus, and even Stoicism, if applied correctly, can exist in the world realistically and all over. But then you got me thinking that I often see Christian thought, be it like Christian fiction or just writings from various Christians or things I'm seeing coming out of the Vatican, conceive of utopia or conceive of heaven still as geographically and temporally distant, or even like metaphysically distant. And I guess I just wanted to get your impression. Are we still guilty of this notion of like heaven or a utopia as too distant?
You mean in a Christian context or more generally?
Yeah, in a Christian context. Like I'm thinking of like Inferno. I'm going to embarrass myself if I misquote Inferno, but heaven's on top of a mountain, right? It is distant. It is set up as this physically distant place.
Yeah, it's a great question. Right, let's have the second one, and then I guess I'll answer to this one.
No, thank you for your fantastic presentation. It was so enlightening. You kind of touched upon this already, but my question is kind of a more just kind of modern interpretation of Epicureanism. How relevant do you think it is specifically in handling kind of the global fallout with the pandemic? I think as we retreat further and further into these, virtual worlds, where this virtual setting, kind of our virtual spirituality, etc., I think it's dangerous to an extent. To what degree do you think Epicureanism can kind of bring us back into this physical world, physical appreciation for a more tangible existence? And do you think there's validity there for kind of bringing together a sort of peace and friendship with some of these Epicurean ideals?
Okay, I guess I'll begin from this last question. This is another great question, and funny enough, this text of Lucretius that I've showed you ends up with a description of a pandemic. It's a fascinating scene. He ends up with this long account of the plague of Athens. Also a passage that Hobbes loved very much. Everyone is dying, and no one no one respects the laws or anything, and this triumph of death. And Lucretius shows that society comes apart under the pandemic, right? Now, I think what I find interesting about Epicureanism is the emphasis on friendship as a kind of the nucleus for a renewal of society. That's incredibly fascinating. On the other hand, there is this risk of this kind of Benedictine withdrawal. And one of the things I do typically with my students when I teach Epicureanism, I contrast the account of the plague by Lucretius with accounts of the reactions of Christians to the plague, the 3rd century plague, if I'm not mistaken. Because that's a situation in which, on the contrary, the Christian communities were under attack and under scrutiny from the pagans. They do what no one else could do, which was get out there to help the others, because they're not terrified by that. And this completely turns around the perception of the role of Christians in society at that moment, right? So there you do see kind of the reality of friendship, but a completely different approach that emerges in a similar context. I think also one of the other thing I like about Epicureanism, and typically students' response to it, is you can use it to test a materialistic approach to life, right? Is it true that like pleasure is enough for happiness? Because deep down, it's one forms of materialism. When I poll my students about their personal philosophies, many, and I think it's a temptation for me as well, I kind of turn to forms of materialism, right? Forms attempt to experience happiness through comfort and pleasure too, right? Is this enough? That's another that's another good way to think about Epicureanism. In terms of Anne-Marie's question, it's a great question. I think what I like about this text, that there's always a tension between this being very distant, but at the same time somehow happening now, right? Even in Virgil's poem, right? It's a utopian view, but at the same time, the child is supposed to be born now, to an extent, right? So there is a tension between these two dimensions, and the Epicurean solution, for instance, is imagined as a kind of a compromise in as you await the conversion of humanity, this distant. But the idea is that this distant utopia, you can't experience it fully, but you can replicate it in this microcosm, right? You can bring the city within your own home and have the ideal city in the Bay of Naples as you await the larger conversion of humanity. If this answers somehow your question.
Yeah, I think that does help clarify. It's something I'm going to have to think about more as I continue to read, but that was beneficial.
It strikes me that another voice we probably should bring in at some point is Augustine's notion of distinguishing the city of God and the city of man, or the human city, such that utopias, at least from some readings of Augustine, are supposed to be avoided and put off, because that's an anticipation of the final state of the end community. But let's go to I had Anna and then Claire. Let's go back to back, and then back to Stefano. And I'm going to bring us back into our group here so we can all see each other's faces in a little more community.
Yep.
Let's go to Anna and then Claire.
Hi. So I was really intrigued by the idea of like reclusive, that kind of way that they just retreated into their community so that they could, practice their philosophy like that. And I was wondering if you happen to know if there's any modern equivalents of that, whether it's like a literal philosophic community or even kind of like less literal and more abstract kind of modern versions of our Epicureans and Stoic communities. Like I know that there's like individual Stoics that you mentioned, but do you know if there's any like community, like modern versions of this in a community sense?
I mean, I kind of joked. I'm sorry, we had the other question, right? Let's have the other question, then I'll answer both of them.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quick. So my question is, I think it's so interesting that a major part of Epicurean success is that everybody is converted to Epicureanism. What happens if, let's say, they hit this utopia goal where everybody is Epicurean, and then someone decides, you know what, I actually don't love this, I'm going to revert to what I was thinking before? Would they be exiled from community? Would the whole community fall apart? What kind of implications would that have?
Yeah, it's another great question, and that it's also a question that the Stoics have at some point. So what do you do with those who defect? I mean, there's two visions of this utopia. Epicurean seems to have this vision that everyone has to be somehow, an Epicurean for this to work. And at some point, Lucretius says, well, maybe not everyone, but at least if you have a critical mass, like 80% of people, that society will still work, and you can work out to isolate the few outliers. Whereas in Stoics, the temptation of Stoics is, again, on the contrary, to resort to the idea that, well, if that happens, then you're going to have those few wise people somehow enforce the laws of the new society onto the other ones. That's what the Stoics think. For the Epicureans, their idea is, in truth, they are really operating with an awareness that this ideal will not become a reality anytime soon, and that they need to figure out their existence in an hostile society. That's another reason why they're compared to early Christians, because they have this emphasis on kind of evangelizing, converting others, while at the same time, initially, they don't expect that their society will become a reality anytime soon, and they need to operate under an hostile environment. In terms of examples of communities, Anna's question, that was also a great question. I jokingly referred to the Benedict option as an example. It was like a modern Christian attempt to, I mean, what I'm saying, as a temptation that there is for Christian communities as well, to fall into the idea that society cannot be redeemed, which was what the Epicureans thought. And therefore, the only thing is to withdraw from it and to create these insulated communities that can protect themselves from modernity. And I think this is an example that can be found also in other religious movements, in other also religious realities outside of Christianity. And I think it's a great challenge. It's a great challenge of modernity, right? In this kind of post-Constantinian era, this option will always be, I think, on the horizon as a possibility and needs to be discussed, right? Whether that's what we want to do.
Thank you, Stefano. I'm also thinking of at the end of After Virtue, where Alistair McIntyre suggests that in situations of imperialism and social dissolution, there is a tendency towards Stoicism as a counter response. That he's sort of, he's talking in the 80s. But let's go to Father Luke next.
I had an observation, or I was fascinated when you showed the pictures of the plan of the papyri, because suddenly I found myself transported back to Ostia and the experience of wandering around in ancient places. And of course, the local family dwellings, particularly the urban dwellings of the wealthier families, would be a kind of a miniature of that. And I wonder, is there not also part of the gospel of Augustus in his moral legislation, his emphasis on whether it was real or not, but his emphasis on the value of the family? Is the Roman notion of the family with the paterfamilias, who has a patron-client relationship with others, who has really absolute power over his local grouping, is that a kind of a miniature in some ways of the Epicurean model, and yet one that is actively, dynamically involved with the polis? Because again, from the later Christian monastic standpoint, it's becoming clearer that it's probably out of that kind of a matrix that Christian monasticism actually evolves. But that's a separate question.
You mean out of the matrix of the Roman family kind of model?
Partly, yes.
Not the Epicurean community, not the Epicurean community. No. Yeah, okay. I think this is a great question, because also one of the things that I was thinking is also, I think, to consider monasticism, right? In what ways will be the monastic communities different from these little Epicurean utopias or secluded societies? That's interesting for me to think about it. I think you're absolutely right in the sense that the analogy of the family is crucial to Augustan ideology. Like, not by chance he presents himself as the pater patriae, the father of the country. So he's reproducing in the political order the authority of the pater familias, who has absolute power over, even power of life and death, over the one, the individuals. And here I think there is a major distinction between the Roman family model that becomes a political model and Epicurean ideas, because these Epicurean communities, I didn't discuss it enough, but they were very democratic and egalitarian. They actually abolished social distinctions between slaves and free people, men and women. Women were admitted and played an important role, right? The Roman house is very interesting in the sense that in Epicurean and non-Epicurean context, there's this idea of the house especially the villa, the countryside house, has a place where the world of politics is kept outside to an extent. Like in Roman houses, you don't find pictures of the emperor to an extent. There's very limited use of political symbols. And that makes them appropriate to be exploited by the Epicureans as the seeds of the Roman, the little utopias, precisely because they're already kind of preset as spaces where the world of politics is not supposed to enter. I hope this answers some other question. It was a very complex question for me.
We have time for one more question from Annabella.
Cool. Yeah, also thank you again for such an enriching presentation. This is just kind of a hypothetical question, but so you said the gospel of Jesus obviously integrates and completes all three of these utopias in response to the anxieties brought up from them. But if you had to choose one of the three, if Christianity just like didn't exist, like which one would you think is the most reflective of Christianity and I don't know, the most ideal in your opinion?
You mean that's a great question. You mean in terms, in political terms, or more generally? Like would you think more generally? More
generally, I think, yeah.
Like if I had to convert and Christianity didn't exist, would I be a Stoic Epicurean, or would I just be a Roman who enjoys living life under Augustus? It's really hard for me to think. Again, I'm really attracted by Epicureanism because I think its pessimism and kind of approach is again down to earth, an idealistic approach to humans is very effective. It strikes me as very true. On the other hand, so I don't know, but I would know that I'd convert just because I don't think that pleasure is enough for happiness. But on the other hand, I think Stoicism is super fascinating. And that's one of the reasons why it's fascinating today, because it's an empowering ideal, right? It tells you that you can turn yourself into a perfect individual. You don't need anyone's help to do so, like by perfectly using your mind, and you can achieve perfect control over the outside world. I think Stoicism also has a better recipe for in a sense dealing with the problem of suffering, and it's this idea that you can kind of insulate yourself from reality to the extent that what happens around you does not affect your mind. You can always maintain power over your mind. I think it's also appealing because it's got this strong sense of freedom, that you can be free even under. And I think this connects with what David was saying, right? That when in terms of tyranny, Stoicism is an option because it tells you that at least you can be free in your mind, right? Even if you're kept subjugated in your political institutions, then you can be free your mind. I know I'm escaping your question. I'm not really providing an answer. Probably, if you were in class, I would ask you, which one would you prefer, right? But bounce the question back at you.
Annabella, would you like to comment?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, they all have different appeals that are attractive, but I feel like Epicureanism I might choose, but I don't know. It's hard. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a tough one. I think the Hadot book on Epicureanism, using a line from Marcus Aurelius, the citadel of the self, that you don't just withdraw into a community of friends, but you just withdraw inside the fortress of your own mind. It's because it's so, in a way, we would say hyper-individualistic, right? Should we go to Albert? You have your hand up for one more question, and then we'll wrap up and take a break.
Oh, yes. Thank you. It's kind of really interesting for me because I'm a recent convert from Buddhism about a year ago. And I come from, I think, that really different background culturally in many ways. So when I was reading the material and also hearing the presentation, it was just so interesting because I saw so much similarities with things that I learned from Asian culture or Korea or Buddhism, such as there's a saying in Buddhism called, in Korean word, 공수래 공수거, which means you are born with empty hands and you die with empty hands. So there's no need to be greedy about any material possession. And that is very interesting because like it's such a this in terms of geographically so far away, but there's a lot of similarities in terms of the utopia that people dreamed of. And there's also another saying, I think in English word it's called moksha, but in Korean it's called 해탈. It's a term in Hinduism and Buddhism for liberation and release of pain in mind and body through enlightenment. So there was one part in the reading, I think it was, so this terrifying darkness that intrudes the mind must be dispelled not by the sun's rays and the dazzling darts of the day, but by the study of superficial aspects and underlying principles of nature. And I thought, wow, that's very similar to Buddhism in a way. And it was just really interesting. And so, well, that's just my comment about my personal take with the presentation. But like personally, I could not stop questioning about, stop connecting the utopia concept from the past with the modern days. And I could not stop asking the question, what happened? You know, like how did world has become this? Where my experience with the living in United States, at least, has been, there are three biggest things that influenced me in United States. Actually two. One is capitalism and second is greed. That seems to be the most prevalent ideas here. And even though from the Asians' perspective, we call United States as a Western society, but why has this society been so drastically, it seems very far away from the Western utopia concept that you brought up, and there's so much rich poverty gap, and also like there's one thing in the reading, something like being wealthy is being poor and being poor is being rich, but it doesn't seem that way right here. And it almost feels like we are going against the time. So so past during the Stoicism or that Roman time, there's more liberal or democratic or progressive possibly than now. And my question is like what, like I was wondering, like when you were studying about this utopia, have you ever had questions like this? Like, why is the modern world going further away from what seems like, you know, the utopia definition from the past? Why is it going further away? How this has all happened? Like, have you ever had questions like that?
Absolutely. I wonder about it all the time, every day. I think you made two wonderful points. I mean, first of all, the similarity between Buddhism and Epicureanism. You're absolutely right, spot on. It's entirely there. And I visited Korea a few months ago because my brother lived there and kind of got involved a little with the reality of Christian communities in Korea and in general with the culture. First of all, I was entirely blown away by Korean culture. For me, it was really, it got me thinking every time about Christianity, beginnings within the Roman context, right? In the same way as, you know, Korea being a country that only was exposed to Christianity much later and had this background, Buddhism and Confucianism, that has so many points of contact with these ancient ideas, right? To go back to it's important, these utopias these communities that I've described, they were never kind of mainstream realities in Rome. The Roman Empire was very similar to our society. It was a society was characterized by massive social injustices. People didn't live in the Villa dei Papiri, right? I mean, the gap between the haves and have-nots was huge, comparable to what it is today. And again, the Villa dei Papiri is like a middle-sized mansion. Like this ones are 3 times as big. And you know, someone like Cicero, he owned 13 of those villas, not to mention the other assets he has. Like these are, you know, just like Bill Gates style billionaires. And what's interesting, however, I think, with the onset of Christianity, that the Roman world knows very little revolutions, right? And even these ideas of for instance, the message by Augustus, there's never a strong emphasis on social justice in the sense of reducing the gap, for instance, between the wealthy and the poor. And in practice, there are few uprisings by the oppressed towards it. And just to make a final example, even at some point, there's a slave revolt led by one Spartacus. And he's an ex-gladiator. The story should be it's a perfect story for a novel, but it's a real story. This guy's an ex-gladiator who escapes the school and then gathers a bunch of other slaves and then forms an army and defeats the Roman armies several times, right? Even in his case, was the most heroic attempt to, if you look really closely, Spartacus was probably just trying to get away. It wasn't fighting the institution of slavery per se, just wanted to free himself. And probably if he had become free, he would have acquired slaves himself. So, what I'm saying is that it's hard to see in the Roman world. The reason why I'm saying this is that Christianity also changes this, to an extent, right? It creates the preconditions for more radical action against social injustice. I'm making sweeping generalization. I hope Father Luke doesn't have a heart attack as he hears me saying this. But thank you so much, Albert.
Thank you, Stefano. Can we do our virtual applause for such a rich first session from our colleague Stefano? I know we all really appreciate it, and the thought and effort you put into that, and really raising the question and highlighting it, just how odd Christianity is in the context of, it is against the background, it's intelligible, but then it really is something distinct, not to order politics around fear or around reason or around power, but about love. And then the question is, what political form can that take, should that take, especially over this big divide? We mentioned before Constantine and an idea of a Constantinian Christianity or pre or post-Constantinian. If you need to refresh your memory on the history there, that's around the year 300, 315, 350, 380, depending on how we're dating that, when that cultural reality comes into effect. When we come back after our break, we'll be able to think about some Christian authors on both sides of that divide in the ancient world still, pre and post-Constantine, about how they think about the politeia, the political community, with Professor Darling Young. Before we break, I just wanted to take a brief moment to welcome also Professor Brian Keene, who's joining us, who will be working with Professor Colburn, Cindy Colburn, next time we meet. He's an art historian in Southern California, formerly of the Getty, and now an assistant professor. We're very glad to have him with us. And let's go ahead and take a break. Let's come back in 10 minutes. So 10 minutes before the hour, I'm going to put on I'm going to mute my screen at least. I encourage you all to go have a visual break, and we'll be back in 10 minutes time. Thank you.